Todd has put off the tough double that Ali did earlier. He spent 2 days at a PC meeting, and for those of you who are students, it's a pretty mind-numbing activity. And so he's either going to find his mind or he's going to have no mind. Todd wants to talk about what a typical life in the day of a researcher is. Oh, there we are. Maybe it's a week in the life of a researcher. Thank you, Todd.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for having me. Okay, so it's great to be here. I wish I had had this opportunity when I was a grad student. So thanks to the organizers. This is really awesome. One of the things that I'd like to get across in this talk is, well, what it's like to work at MSR. And partly because if I look back at my own career as a grad student, I looked around me as a grad student, and the definition of success was professors, right? I was working with advisors, and everybody was a professor, and that was what I thought I wanted to do. I kind of landed into MSR without really actually planning for it. I got very lucky, in fact, and I've really enjoyed it. So I'm hoping that actually some of you might also enjoy it. So I hope I give you some perspective on what it's like to work there. Okay, so before I get started, I want to give you a little bit of a background of who I am and how I got into this. So I was born in 1979. I just turned 40 years old. I went as an undergraduate to Syracuse University in upstate New York in 1997. So going back to the boom and bust, you'll see actually that kind of hits my cycles as well, and that is a little bit of where I ended up in a lucky way where I am. So I started a company, or I was one of the first employees at a company called bitpipe.com back in '99. So I was a junior in college at the time. I worked there for a couple of years. We ultimately sold, so I graduated in between here. And I worked there while I was still a student. We ultimately sold right around 2003, 2004. That's right around the time we got lucky that we sold, because that was right around the time where everything started to go down. I applied to grad school, and lo and behold, so did everybody else. I had zero research experience because I was working as a startup, and I didn't get in anywhere. So I started taking classes, I was out in Colorado at the time because I was being a little bit of a ski bum. I was taking classes at Colorado State, which is where Michelle was, as well as University of Colorado, and ultimately I was accepted into the program. I had a great experience as a PhD student. I worked with Amr Dewan as my advisor. We had a great time, a great set of colleagues that I worked with. And then I graduated and finished my degree in 2010, and guess what happened right around then? I was on the job market, and the entire state of California said, we're not going to hire any faculty positions this year. So I was, in trouble. I applied to a bunch of postdocs, amongst a bunch of other faculty jobs. I had a couple interviews, but I didn't land anything. A friend of mine, a guy I had written a paper with, was sitting at a conference with someone who became my ultimate manager, and said, hey, Todd's on the market, you should take a look at him. I had applied to Microsoft, but gotten no response. So it's kind of a who you know type of a story, right? Particularly when you go to your PhD and you finish, a lot of what happens next is based on that network that you build. So look around, get help from your peers, and make friends when you visit a place like MSR or other universities. Okay, so I'm going to now dive into my calendar here and use that as a mechanism to help explain what it is that I do in a given week. So the first thing I do before I get to work is I bike to work. This is, if people are familiar with Microsoft, I see a lot of faces in here of interns that have either been there before or faculty that have been there before. I live on what's called the East Side. I have about a 5-mile bike ride to work. So I get up in the morning, I bike to work, and I grab a cup of coffee, and then I come in and I look at this. This is my calendar. Now, what I've done, this is actually my calendar from last week. I've removed 2 items from the calendar, which I can't show outside of Microsoft. So that's the only thing that I've taken off. And I don't mean for you to actually read the entire calendar. That's not the point of this talk. What I'm going to try and do is actually highlight key points of it and talk about what those events on my calendar entail in my day-to-day job. Okay, so let's look at how my job is a little bit like being a faculty member in a very large academic department. So this is a picture of MSR for a lot of people who have been there, and for those who haven't. It's a big foyer. There's a lot of rooms along the side. My office is in the back corner there. There's a huge number of people in various different areas that work at a place like MSR. So we have hundreds of researchers working there, right? Working on anything from systems. So I work also in an area called RISE, which is research and software engineering. So we do like formal methods, compilers, high performance computing. Other people work on hardcore systems problems. Some people work on networking problems. There's a group on HCI. You pretty much name it, we have it. There are people who work in quantum. There's an ability group, which is a group that's trying to make computing more accessible. So it's kind of a unique place, right? I mean, you can look around the hallways and find somebody who's working on an interesting problem if you believe that you have a solution in that area, right? I mean, if you run in and want to work in HCI, or you need to know how to run a user study, you can go knock on someone's door and get an expert to help you do that. So it's a really unique place, just given the breadth and scale of people that are actually working there. On top of that, my job is also similar to like working in a large department, in that at the end of the year, I'm evaluated on my external impact. And one of those things that I do, like Calvin mentioned, is I'm on PCs. I help run conferences. So I have a significant amount of my job is actually spent, even though I don't have that to show you on my calendar, I didn't actually do any of that this week when I took a snapshot. I spend a lot of portion of my time working on external service. So the other nice thing about MSR being like a large academic department is that there's a significant amount of talks in a given week, colloquial, that happen during the course of the week. So I've just highlighted here 4 of those talks. There are talks on various things like crypto, deep learning. Someone's actually showing a new hardware platform. A lot of those talks are from internal, so they're people inside Microsoft providing perspectives. They could be product groups or other researchers. And a lot of them are actually external people from other universities or even companies that we've brought in to give their perspective on a particular problem. So, I wish I could show you the abstracts of all the talks to kind of really help you explain to the breadth of the talks that are actually going on in a given week at Microsoft. I can't necessarily do that. But what I can do is point you to this recent podcast series that our outreach team has done. I don't know if people are familiar with it. If you search for MSR, Microsoft Research Podcasts, it'll show right up. What it is people have gone out and interviewed a bunch of different researchers. There's about 80 of them right now, and there's being more every week. And in those interviews are accessible interviews. In fact, I've sent a couple to my mom, who is not a computer scientist at all, but in order to help her understand a little bit of what I do. So they're very accessible, and they're really useful to understand what the heck goes on within a big organization like Microsoft Research. So this can be a really helpful way for you as an outsider to really get a good insight into what the heck is going on here. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about, so I kind of have covered a little bit about what's going on at Microsoft in the context of like a comparison to what you might be experiencing in your day-to-day as kind of viewing it as a big department. And part of my job is also then to do research. Now, I really don't like this term blue sky research, but that's kind of, I'm going to try and use it to convey and contrast with some of the other types of research that I like to do. So there's a lot of problems that we focus on in Microsoft where we are not driven by products, right? We have some idea that we would like to work on that, I don't have to actually have an interaction with a product team to actually work on that. One of the examples, so let me give you a very concrete example here. We've been working on this technique. In fact, Roshan here is in the audience, and he's going to present this talk tomorrow for an accepted paper at PLDI on a compiler for fully homomorphic encryption. So let me give you an example of what this is. And so fully homomorphic encryption is this crazy idea where you can take 2 plain text variables, call them A and B. So you just take 2 concrete values, and you want to apply some operation on them. Maybe you want to sum them up together. So what homomorphic encryption lets you do is take those variables, encrypt them with a secret key, and now you have these encrypted values called out those A's and B's, right? Now this encryption is just like RSA encryption that you would use in a standard everyday thing. It has slight variance on it, but it's generally speaking as mathematically secure as RSA. What homomorphic encryption lets you do is apply an operation on that resulting encrypted data, and it's as if you would have worked on that, done that operation on the unencrypted data. So you can decrypt it and get back the result of A plus B. It's kind of mind-blowing, right? That you've actually been able to take something that is mathematically secure, but at the same time do operations on it. Just as a very high level, this whole thing is called fully homomorphic if you can do both multiplication and addition, because then you can do arbitrary circuits for relatively complex computations. So if you look at the kind of trajectory of FHE over time, this is a little bit why I'm talking about it in terms of blue sky and why this is not something that a product team is going to be interested in at any point in time. So if you look at this idea, it came out in 2009 by a man named Gantry while he was doing his PhD. The idea here is effectively, if you look at the y-axis, this is the slowdown of fully homomorphic encryption over just plain text operations. Right? The magnitude here is in the log scale, and this is on to something to the 12th. I mean, this is massively slow, right? And the reason was because they were working on arbitrary bits. So researchers in the crypto area figured out that you could actually extend this to work on not just bits, but maybe you actually want to work on integers or fixed point representation or even higher order data structures. And so over time, you start to see people chomping away at these massive slowdowns. You know, if you look at where we are right now, you're still 4 orders of magnitude slower, roughly, than what you can do today, or what you could do on unencrypted data. It's going to be a hard sell to go to a product team and get them to integrate that into something. I think, however, what Roshan has been able to show over the past summer was that he's able to, for a certain class of programs, make these computations run roughly at the speed of what an 8086 coprocessor can do. So to put that in perspective, this is roughly the speed of a processor in the early 80s. So that seems crazy. I mean, it seems crazy slow, right? We've made a lot of progress in hardware since then. But it's still, there's a lot of interesting things that people did back with an 8086, right? So we're starting to get to the point of where it's actually maybe reasonable to start thinking about using this in very constrained domains. So the idea here where we started was there's no way this is ever going to work in a practical application, to now thinking about actually if we even now extend this with other types of specialized hardware, we might actually be able to use this in the context of a real application. So a lot of the work that we do in MSR is not product driven, but it does, we're always constantly trying to keep in the back of our mind whether or not the ideas that people are doing will potentially disrupt the things that Microsoft is working on. So I personally always have a viewpoint of how is the work that I'm working on right now, either something that we can take to product or something that I can use to help, tell, for instance, some of the cloud providers within Microsoft, these are the things that if you really want to do FHE in the cloud, here are the things that you really have to worry about, right? So I hope that kind of helps understand a little bit of what we think about, or at least what I think about when we start to do research. So another thing I want to make sure I cover is that interns are a lot of the way that we make forward progress, partly because they bring new ideas and new perspectives into the organization. So if I go back to my calendar here, in the given week, our group right now has about 4 interns. So the interns have just started, so everybody's kind of getting up to speed and ramping up. And so oftentimes you spend a lot of time with them at the beginning of their internship to help them get perspective on what the problems are that they should focus on. And so I have four meetings with them over the course of the week. And so that's another thing that we do is mentor interns. I hope I get to see some of you here in the coming summers. So lastly, my job is to, like I said, not only am I thinking about disruption, but I'm also thinking about how to actually take ideas that we've come up with and potentially if we've gotten to the point where we think we actually have a solid idea, how do we actually turn that into a product? So that is definitely something that we keep in mind. So I want to tell you a little bit of a story behind an idea. Back in 2013, Madan Musavati, who's also in the audience here, and I had this idea that we could use symbolic execution in order to parallelize sequential programs. Now at the time, this was kind of a crazy idea. We didn't know if it was going to work. So let me go into little details of what I mean when I say parallelizing sequential programs with symbolic execution. So if you look at what people do today, they often, when they parallelize an algorithm, they look for independent computation. Once you find independent computation, you can map it down to your parallel hardware and you have a parallel algorithm. But there are a lot of algorithms, unfortunately, that have dependencies, right? You might have something like this, where it doesn't look like there's actually a lot of potential for parallelism. It's inherently sequential. So what we started thinking about is, how do we actually take something that looks like this and make it into something that's embarrassingly parallel? And the way that we're going to try and do that is through symbolic execution. So let me give you a very high-level overview of our approach. So suppose that you have a bunch of data. You split it off into a bunch of different machines. And each machine wants to do some very small little computation on it. But you have dependencies between these machines. So here's a recipe for how to parallelize this stuff. The first is that you replace those dependencies with symbolic unknowns. Once you do that, do a partial evaluation locally on each machine to produce some symbolic representation of that unknown. And of course, then you have a kind of a map and reduce phase. In this reduction phase, you plug in the value, the concrete value, into the f function that you produce. That gets composed with the g function and h function respectively. And that gives you then the result of what the sequential algorithm would have done. Now, of course, there are clearly two big problems with this. And this is why we were a bit crazy, thinking we were crazy that this would actually work in practice. And that is that the symbolic execution has to be as fast as the sequential run, right? Because there's one machine that's actually running the sequential algorithm, the first one. And the second piece is that you have to be able to compress the computation. So you can't have the situation where that composition at the very end is incredibly slow. So we had this insight that dependencies don't travel too far, and we thought that would actually help us in practice. So we actually had a lot of help from interns from taking this crazy idea that we came up with in 2014, and we wrote a paper that showed that this worked on just regular DFAs. So kind of going back to the easiest computational model we could figure out. And then we brought in an intern, and we gave him this problem. Now we had no idea how to actually make progress on this harder problem of applying this technique to dynamic programming algorithms. We gave it to him and we said, hey, you seem to have some expertise in this area. Good luck, I hope you figure it out. And he did a great job. And he brought new insights to our problem that let us actually solve that particular domain. We did the same thing with another intern, Veselin Rechev, who came in 2015 and applied the idea to temporal data matching in MapReduce-like programs. And we have others as well. Yufei Ding came and worked on it for a bunch of KNN distance algorithms. So interns have come and really taken the idea that we had and really solidified it and made it useful. So we've been recently working on stochastic gradient descent. So that's the thing that we're working on right now. So stochastic gradient descent is an algorithm that people use in the context of deep learning or machine learning. So it's a very important algorithm for Microsoft. Some of these other algorithms or the other successes we had were great, but if you look at the amount of computational resources we use at Microsoft in the stochastic gradient descent domain, there's a significant amount there. And so we have a massive way, if we solve that problem, then we can really help product teams turn around time and use less computational resources. So we've been working and pushing on that, and if you look at my calendar, I actually have 2 meetings a week with product teams where we report on our results and they report on theirs, and we kind of come to try and figure out ways to come together so that we can take this idea that we came up with and have put into research and put into papers and actually make it useful in practice in real products. Okay, so the other thing to think about when you're looking at a job as an MSR researcher is that my title is what's called an individual contributor. And in fact, everyone at MSR is an individual contributor. What that means is that I don't manage anyone, which is good, but it's also bad. So why is it good? Well, it's good because I can work on anything that I want. I've never been told by my manager to work on a particular problem. I think that's an incredibly unique statement to be able to make. And so as a consequence, it's a very bottom-up organization, right? A lot of the ideas that get ultimately generated come from the bottom. However, it's a bad thing, or not a bad, but it's a challenge because often your ideas are bigger than what you can actually accomplish as an individual. And so you need to find ways to interact and connect with your peers to actually drive toward a bigger solution. And so if you look at my calendar, we actually have, in a given week, I have a big stand-up Scrum, which is this 10 o'clock meeting here, where I work with 4 peers. Madan Saeed Maliki, the intern, we actually hired him as a full-time student after he finished, and Ali Sarakov, who's now a postdoc with us. So all 4 of us, we meet once a week, or meet once a day. We quickly go over what we're working on, what problems and challenges we're running into, and what help we need from other people. We also have resources from Microsoft itself. So once a week, we actually have a project manager who helps us kind of prioritize and organize how we're going to write papers, what places we're going to target, how we're going to integrate with particular product teams, who should we be talking to. So not only are we self-integrating and trying to drive a bigger agenda, but we're also getting help from the organization to help organize how we run our meetings. Okay, so the last thing that I think is really important to stress is work-life balance. And for me, I have 2 ways that I deal with work-life balance. Now, if I look around the room, you're here because you're probably self-motivated, right? And I think all of us are self-motivated, and oftentimes you really need to take a step back and figure out a way to decompress. For me, I bike to work. That's my way to kind of get rid of my energy in the morning and afternoon. But I also call out in my calendar an explicit time where I spend time with my family. So my daughter is a kindergartner. She gets out at 2 o'clock on Wednesdays from school. She, my wife, and my son, who's 3 years old, we all go up. I mean, I know this is June and it's still on my calendar, but we all go up and we ski. So we spend time skiing at the local ski hill. And the way that I would be able to make that work is by explicitly blocking it out of my calendar. And I work in an organization where that kind of thing is actually okay. Okay, so that's pretty much what I have to say. I think you've gotten a lot of advice here from a lot of different people and a lot of different perspectives. I can't believe I'm the one who's giving that advice now. I'm telling you now, it goes so fast, you'll be up here very soon. And I still don't know if I know what's going on. So, so with that, I'd love to take some questions. Please.
So yeah, my question is first. So what is a career path for a research scientist in execution side kind of MSR? I mean, you mentioned you're a graduate computer.
Yep.
And so you're not a research scientist. So is there any place like beyond that? So.
Sure. Good question. So I think I'll speak to Microsoft. I think different organizations have different titles. So that's the one thing to first keep in mind is titles. So I'm a researcher. There's also developers within the research organization. So you could imagine going through and being a developer where you want to take ideas from research and actually integrate them into not necessarily products, but actually be part of, do more of the implementation to demonstrate that ideas actually work. So both of those tracks, researcher and research developer, start out effectively, you can be your own, it's its own track, right? I mean, I can keep going up the Microsoft hierarchy as long as I'd like, as long as I succeed, and still be an individual contributor and not have to actually manage people. There are alternatives where you could imagine I could move into a product team, and that sometimes happens where people feel like they can actually have bigger impact if they're actually moved to the team to carry out their idea. Alternatively, you could also move into management within the Microsoft research organization itself. Yeah.
Actually, one quick thing. Just for those of you that are new to the community, MSR has an incredible impact in the PL community. Obviously, researchers doing amazing work, but also, as Todd said, there's lots of interns and people that sort of work their way through MSR. And I was just wondering, for those of you that are new in the community, can the people that have done internships at MSR raise your hands that are here? So there's a lot of people that sort of go through MSR. It's a great sort of connection point for a lot of people here.
So my question actually goes on that. I don't know if everybody knows this. Microsoft Research has a very large PL group, and it's probably evident at the PC meeting where you're probably out of the room now.
Yeah.
But my question is this. Typically, how much interaction do you have with other researchers at MSR who are not, or any researchers who are not in PL? And I'm sure that's partly a matter of taste.
Yep.
But could you just answer,
Sure.
what's it look like?
So I think there's a massive amount of interaction. You're walking down the hall and you talk to a systems person and you all of a sudden strike up a conversation. In fact, the FHE work started because of a conversation in the hall between a crypto person and a PL person, right? I think we also have organized events. So once a year we have a retreat where we all go off and not within our, I don't interact with other PL people. In fact, I'm kind of forced not to, right? where we have a lot of that kind of an interaction. So it happens a lot. Yeah.
Other questions?
So thanks, everybody. We're basically at the end of the program. Let's quickly thank Todd.